This episode is brought to you by Audi. The road is calling. Embrace the thrill of the drive with the all-new, fully electric Audi Q6 e-tron. Featuring effortless power, serious acceleration, and advanced Audi tech. It's not just a new EV. It's a new way to experience driving. The all-new, fully electric Audi Q6 e-tron is here. The next chapter of Audi starts now.
You are tuned in to the FowlWeather Podcast, the forecast to your next successful hunt. Coming to you from the home office, Jack's Reef, New York.
Why have those mallards gotten fat since Thanksgiving? In this episode, we detail the body condition patterns of ducks and how it can affect your duck hunting success. The cold continues, and we forecast the best days to hunt in the coming week for fresh ducks hot from the north. We also announce our first prize in the Listener Appreciation FowlWeather Podcast Sweepstakes and the availability of the FowlWeather Podcast Carhartt hoodies and hats. All that and more on this week's episode of the FowlWeather Podcast. Hey, thanks everyone for listening, and remember to share, like, and follow us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Facebook, and Instagram. Also, take a second to rate us on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, as well as share the FowlWeather Podcast with friends. Remember that you know where the ducks are at before the ducks know where they're at. We're really thankful for our weekly listeners. You folks know who you are. Those that never miss a single migration forecast episode each Monday morning. Y'all are as ate up as me about ducks, duck biology, and duck migration. Our dedicated weekly listeners can pick the best days to hunt because the FowlWeather Podcast forecasts fresh ducks hot from the north. Shoot the ducks from the north before they know where they're at. And also remember that we are the only science-based duck migration forecast available. Brought to you by hunters for hunters. I'm your host, Dr. Mike, coming to you from the home office in chilly Jack's Reef. Brr. Oh, I just got out of the deer stand. We're trying to put one more in the freezer. We got that one nice buck, but we've just been passing little bucks and does and fawns, and our rut is on the tail end, but man, did I get cold this morning. So, it's chilly out there in Jack's Reef country. We hope everyone had a wonderful Thanksgiving with family and friends, and the duck hunting was spectacular. I'm guessing that it was for most. The weather severity came just in time for most, and the reports are about good shooting throughout all 4 flyways. Most of Canada is now covered, at least with a dusting of snow, and the freeze line has driven well into the U.S. in most parts. At the farm, we put the finishing touches on a few leftover items, and the seed catalogs have arrived in the mailbox. It never ends. As we brush hog down some remaining stems of corn, did our annual grinding of bags of cornmeal for the fish fries and kind of those duck dry rubs, and stored away the Brussels sprouts, the seed catalogs were also out as we think about next year's growing season with a warm fire in the background and bourbon in hand. Soon enough, we'll be into those darkest days of winter. We're going to be reflecting on the past year and looking to the next to grow out the farm and make our lives full with hard work and successful harvests. Each year, annual cycles at the farm are consistent and timed with the weather and photo period to get the most out of the ground that we work. Ducks have an annual cycle that is adapted to the weather and photo period too. They fatten up, and then they lose weight in a predictable pattern that makes sense. Unfortunately, I also tend to fatten and lose weight in predictable patterns, right? Kind of wishing that fattening was less during this holiday season. But anyhow, later in this episode, we go into great detail about what controls the annual body condition patterns in ducks, because it really has a lot to do with migration and ducks in front of your blind. Understanding those body condition patterns is certainly important in how we manage habitat for ducks and how we manage our duck hunting pressure to shoot more ducks. We also have to understand that my annual pattern at the farm is certainly different from someone, say, in Mississippi. So goes the pattern in ducks as well, and how and when they react to weather. A mallard in Illinois in January reacts differently to weather than a duck in Mississippi in January. So we also will dig into the so-called idea of the myth of January migration, which is not completely incorrect, but certainly overstated. All of this is tied to body condition and how a duck is adapted to survive winter. Before we get into the rest of the episode, two really exciting announcements. We are doing a listener appreciation FowlWeather Podcast Sweepstakes over the next 5 weeks. In addition to the FowlWeather Podcast team itself, the sweepstakes is sponsored by the Farmland Group and Wildlife Strategies. The rules are going to be simple. Each week for 5 weeks, we will give away a prize to one lucky follower. Once the post with the item is up on our Instagram and Facebook page, you need to tag a friend and tell us where you are from and the general area you tend to hunt. We're not trying to spot steal, right? Something like White River or Great Lakes or Missouri is just fine. Everyone that tags someone and adds this information will be entered into the sweepstakes. If the tagged people want to be entered, all you need to do is tag a friend as well. Each Sunday, we will randomly draw a winner, announce it on the podcast on Monday, and post that winner to our social media outlets. We will then contact the winner by PM to get their address and send them their prize. A note, though, you will have to be a follower of the FowlWeather Podcast on Facebook or Instagram for us to be able to contact you by PM. We just can't do that with any random person that doesn't follow. It only allows us to contact folks by personal message that are followers. So you have to do that. That's the only caveat. Sorry, there's not much we can do about that. Items will be really high quality stuff with logos from Wildlife Strategies and the FowlWeather Podcast. We appreciate our listeners and want to see all represent the podcast in the field and at the diners across Duck Country, USA. The first prize this week will be a pit bag in shadowgrass camo. So check out our social media on Facebook and Instagram to get registered to win. We also just opened pre-orders for FowlWeather Podcast gear. These are high-quality Carhartt hoodies and winter hats or beanies. We also have truck and gear stickers. All of this can be found on our webpage at fowlweather.co, and then click on the shop link in the upper right. These are pre-orders, so once we get enough, we will process and ship your order. Please check out the link for details. Next up, we talk duck body condition, how it changes throughout the year, and how it can influence your hunting success. So please stick with us. Look, folks, the Farmland Group across the Mid-South is your one-stop shop for real estate brokerage, consulting, management, lending, and appraisals. If you own land or you want land, the Farmland Group is where it's at. With over $500 million in farm sales and growing, Gwynn and Shelby Smith have you covered. Look, if you're thinking about buying or selling, contact the Farmland Group to access their full suite of services. If you already own property and want to build equity and value, the Farmland Group gets it done. If you're looking to purchase a new property, well, they get that done too, and they have access to some of the best lending available. Looking to sell? Get it appraised with the Farmland Group affiliated appraiser. But let's be clear for our listenership too. They also offer farm and hunt property management to create places that attract more ducks and more bucks. Who doesn't want that? More ducks and more bucks. Let the Farmland Group build value into your property. Find them today at farmlg.com. That's farmlg.com. You're not going to be disappointed. Contact Shelby Smith today at farmlg.com and let him know that the FowlWeather Podcast sent you their way. All right, and we are back. So let's talk about fattening up those ducks with high-quality habitat. First and foremost, we have to remember that ducks only carry as much fat or fuel and protein as needed to survive and reproduce, and that the amounts they carry are shaped through evolutionary time. That is, natural selection works on ducks, so that in simplest terms, those that made good decisions lived and carried on their genetic code, and those that did not died and that genetic code was lost. So think of it this way. Ducks are pre-programmed by their genetic makeup to behave in certain ways at certain times of the year that maximize likelihood of survival and reproducing. Second, think about this. I put up a picture in my Ecology and Management of Waterfowl class at ESF of a pair of mallards in flooded timber sitting on the water next to a fallen down cherry bark oak tree, and I asked the students, hey, here's the deal. It is late January in Mississippi. What are these ducks doing? All right, of course, we get a lot of mixed answers, but the correct answer is basically nothing. Those ducks are doing nothing. These are paired ducks that fattened up during the months of November and December and are just hiding out, surviving. They are coasting. But let's back up a bit and think about what happens after fledging in the summer and go from there. Ducklings grow by eating insects on the breeding grounds. They need protein to grow and produce feathers. Carbohydrates in the form of seeds and tubers are not needed at this time of year to any large degree, right? Ducklings also get fats directly from insects and aquatic animal matter at this time of year as well. The hens, which just dumped a bunch of protein from their body into making eggs, are in protein mode as well. It's a good thing. It's a great time of year for insects to be produced in these wetlands. This is also one of the reasons why ducks migrate north, to take advantage of longer days for greater foraging time in wetlands with superabundant insects. So it's kind of weird to think about it, but we are really conserving wetland insects to conserve ducks. So we also need to keep the uplands around the wetlands in reasonable condition so that runoff from those areas does not negatively impact insect abundance. Drakes also have basically buggered off from hens and broods because there's no breeding left to be done at this point, and they are molting on their own. But they also need the protein from insects for new feather growth. Come early fall, ducks make their first movements off breeding grounds. Go back and check out episode 6, A Tale of Two Migrations, for more information on this topic. I won't cover all that here. At this time, hungry hens and juveniles are both trying to obtain protein. Hens, to restore that protein from nesting and molt and tending to their young, and juveniles for growth and feather development. So you often find ducks at the north end of their range early in the fall, still focusing on permanent to semi-permanent water with insects in it, and not moist soil seeds and tubers or crops. As the days get shorter, the urge to migrate increases, and at the same time, the weather begins to deteriorate and become more severe. In preparation for migration, and as bet hedging against getting caught too skinny, when the weather gets cold and snowy, ducks start to focus on more carbohydrate-rich foods in the form of seeds and tubers that they can then store as fat. Of course, these are generalizations, and I'm mostly talking about dabbling ducks here. All right, folks, here's the deal, and stick with me on this. Ducks have a hormonal response to shortening day length to feed more. They also have a hormonal response to thresholds of stress brought on by increasingly severe weather that make them migrate. But remember, each duck is different, and they have slightly different thresholds. So we have mallards that are Halloween mallards that migrate early, and then those look to stay north as late as possible before heading south. Think about it this way. Over evolutionary time, very long time periods, this enables a species of duck like a mallard to continue to exist in a variable environment. Over long periods of time, when the weather is very severe during fall and winter, the ducks that try to stay north likely survive and reproduce at a lower rate than those that go to the deep south, so their genetic code becomes more abundant in the population. On the opposite end of it, in a continually warming climate, the ducks that stay farther north may have an advantage, and so these differences in behaviors through time are actually advantageous to the species, in this instance, of mallard's survival. So now we are into October through December. It is that season of harvest on the landscape. Annual seed, weedy, kind of moist soil plants are shutting down and dropping seed. Importantly, most plants, even trees, are shutting down and no longer taking up water. So the rainfall is increasingly raising the water in wetlands and rivers. Snow is starting to show from north to south in North America. The mercury is dropping. and we are headed to the shortest days of the year. At this time, ducks work hard to eat more calories than they burn so they can store fat, because when they have to make the next jump south, they need the fuel to get there. The fat is also used to sit out periods of cold weather. This is why the WSI is a cumulative weather severity index and why it works so well. It takes into account the amount of time it has been cold and snowy. It's not just the immediate weather, but the accumulation of days of weather that typically trigger that threshold in ducks and makes them move south. So they are fat enough and the weather is severe enough, and then they make that next jump. Now, how many jumps do they make? Each individual duck is different, but it's often about 2 or 3 big movements. Some make trickle movements and have up to a dozen migrations, but most only do it in a few. Okay, now that isn't to say that there are only 2 to 3 big migration days each year, because not all ducks migrate at the same time, right? They're not all the same. Very often, it's about 4 to 5 big migration days each year per flyway, but there's also good movement or trickle days in between because ducks, again, are different. Now, if ducks used photoperiod or day length alone, the instinct to migrate would end at the winter solstice around December 20th, right? But that is not the coldest day of the year, and because of the cooling of the Earth's energy, we are typically increasingly cold much longer. So the instinct to migrate is still burnt into the DNA of ducks through at least the end of January. Again, this varies among individuals. Here is the interesting part, though. Once ducks get to their wintering grounds and they know where their food is and where their roost is, they have no need to gain or even sustain much fat because resources are predictable. So what we see is a pattern of ducks losing weight once they reach their terminal location. Upon arrival, they may feed heavily for a few days to restore that fat load lost during migration, but daily movements to feed are typically just enough to sustain them. During extreme cold events, it even becomes advantageous sometimes to sit still and not move because exposure to the weather is riskier than sitting it out and sitting still. You save energy actually by sitting still in the most cold, extreme events. The scientific literature has shown us this. We've done this with black ducks on the coast of Maine, providing them different levels of food under different weather conditions, and under moderate food levels with the most extreme weather, ducks just sit still for the most part. So when food is super predictable, ducks lose weight because if needed, they can always find food to maintain that core body temperature and physiological function. So very often what we see is that poor duck hunting is as much a product of mild conditions at the wintering location as it is a lack of migration of new ducks from the north. For example, last year during that horrible El Nino year, many ducks were still up north. But even those that had arrived in the south didn't need to move as much because the weather was also super mild in the south. What happened when that freeze event occurred in mid to late January last year? Ducks had to move at some point because it lasted too long. Many moved locally, but some also came down from the north, and it was lights out shooting for many. You also may have heard about the myth of January migration, but that is only partially true. The Cohen Lab ducks get used as an example all the time, and I certainly agree that ducks once at the latitude of the Boot Heel of Missouri south, from the Boot Heel of Missouri to the south, they just mill around in search of food and safety. But this is where the disconnect happens and why we need to work together as duck hunters and duck biologists to understand ducks. Not all ducks are at those latitudes, the latitude south of the Boot Heel of Missouri, in January, right? Because ducks are different and they've done different things. And on mild years like last year, we had ducks from Illinois across to New York in abundance into January. But when the cold hit, guess what happened to those ducks in Illinois and New York? They didn't sit still. They disappeared. Now, is this a large portion of the population of ducks? Some years, yeah. Some years, no. Last year was probably a larger portion of the population than in years when it gets cold early. Did those ducks ever reappear on surveys that left Illinois and New York? No, they did not. They went south. Now think about this. Say only 10% of the mallards stayed farther north above the boot heel before the cold snap happened. Well, that's 500,000 mallards headed south in one cold snap if we just use 5 million as the total as our benchmark. In some years, when we had 10 million mallards, think about how many that would be, right? 10% of 10 million is 1 million mallards, kids. That's a lot of ducks to potentially still move south. So those are also ducks moving from a place they know to a place they don't know, and they are really susceptible to harvest. And that cold up north hits earlier and is a deeper cold than even down south. So the ducks locally will reshuffle when they have to because of frozen wetland conditions, but the local ducks also know where the food is once it thaws and will try to sit it out as well. So the myth of January migration is not a thing. I will concede that most of migration and the instinct to migrate is stronger in a good portion of the ducks through October to November, but it still exists in January, because if it didn't, then the ducks that try to stay north would just die. And that makes no sense from an evolutionary standpoint of survival of the fittest or natural selection. To what extent you are shooting local ducks that are reshuffling due to weather, and what extent you are shooting new ducks from the north, well, that's hard to say. And I'd argue that you likely can't use telemetry data to answer this question because the ducks the Cohen Lab is catching are marked either this year or last year and originated from that latitude of the boot heel of Missouri. Right now, I know Forbes Biological Station is marking ducks with GPS backpacks as well, and I'd be interested to know what those ducks do under late cold to know if they stay or if they move. But I think it's a good question to think about and answer. But certainly calling January migration a myth is definitely an overstatement. And we should also consider that it's possible that a small percentage that do move in January are really, really susceptible to harvest. Probably more so than the ducks that know all the safe spots that have been there since November. So I'd say January migration matters, period. We also need to consider that we're looking at ducks with telemetry units on them that have known biases, right? Backpack ducks have known biases. No matter the studies with bands put on at the same location and so on, there are known biases. I'm a fan of implants in ducks if we can do it, and there's a lot of biologists like myself that won't put on backpacks anymore on a duck until the research is done and the evidence is clear that we can answer migration and demographic rate questions with backpack ducks. Local movements with backpack ducks, probably not bad. But I've seen backpacks turn into ice balls, and I've seen many ducks just not react well to them. Ducks are different. So just like the migration where ducks are different, some do okay with backpacks, and others don't. I'll just leave that there for now, but I continue to think that we need to look harder and develop more eloquent studies to answer the same questions we could with telemetry, or at minimum, have complementary studies to telemetry that gather similar data in a different way. Honestly, if you get the money, slapping a backpack on a duck is easy, and it produces sexy results. But we have to be sure that those results are applicable to our management actions. At this time, I personally, having spent years looking at these things, working with folks that have them, and publishing on this, am not 100% convinced. So I say folks that do the backpack stuff, all the telemetry things, get after it. Get rid of those doubts that are out there. All right, backing out of that one. So in late December or January, when I shoot a mallard in New York, I'm looking to full pluck that duck and roast it on the grill. But if I'm in Mississippi by mid-January, many of those ducks just aren't carrying the fat like they did up north. I remember specifically with James Callicutt and Heath Hagee trying to grill whole ducks like I do up here, and they just aren't carrying enough fat to make them taste the same. But here's the deal too, let's complete that annual cycle and think about moving into spring, and this has huge implications for how folks manage their water in the south and mid latitudes. When the weather breaks and the duck brains do start think about going north, when that corticosterone level declines, when the stress hormone declines because the weather becomes milder and the days really longer and longer each day, Ducks once again put on the feed bag and go into what's called hyperphagia, kind of the same thing you just did at Thanksgiving, overeating beyond your caloric needs, and they greatly increase their fat levels before spring migration. This is a critical period to have water and food on the landscape because the earlier ducks arrive on the breeding grounds and with greater fat reserves, generally the better nesting attempts happen and better nest success. Holding water through spring also conditions ducks to your location, so they look to come back to your area next duck season. So holding water is dual-fold. It helps increase the duck population for next year, and it increases the likelihood that a duck will have your place on the brain come next hunting season. So the punchline is this: January duck migration is real, and even on years when the weather has pushed them south and there aren't many to make that last jump, those last 2 weeks in January are often when the weather that causes ducks to reshuffle hits. Heck, the Gadwall last year got crushed during that cold period. But not just Gadwall, because I'm going to tell you this: the social media bitching about no ducks came to a screeching halt, and it got really, really quiet. You know why? Loose lips sinks ships. All right, up next, cold forecast for your migration. And where's the snow? So please stick with us. Hold on, folks. Don't turn that channel. We've got some really exciting news for you. The FowlWeather Podcast has teamed up with Wildlife Strategies. That's right. I'm now working directly with Ryan Delaney of Wildlife Strategies to build value into your land. Wildlife Strategies is already known for quality wildlife habitat management, be it deer, turkeys, ducks, or whatever you pursue. Ryan knows his stuff. Look, I don't add my name to just any business, but I believe in what Wildlife Strategies is doing for landowners throughout the Southeast U.S. and beyond. If you want science-based solutions to create great wildlife habitat, Wildlife Strategies is your best bet. If you're interested in ducks, when we say, may your skies be filled, well, Wildlife Strategies does just that. They fill your skies with ducks. Contact Ryan Delaney today at ryan@farmlg.com for a site visit. You won't be disappointed you did. Ryan covers the southern tier of states, and I'm available to build habitat management plans across the northern tier. Contact us today for a quote. The Wildlife Strategies team sees your property through from the initial assessment and development of a 3-year time frame management plan through annual check-ins and course corrections as needed. Contact Ryan today at ryan@farmlg.com or Dr. Mike at FowlWeather.co. You won't be disappointed you did. Fill your skies with ducks and your forests and fields with deer and turkey with Wildlife Strategies. Before we get into this week's migration forecast, also remember that our photographer of the year is Matt Mezowitz, and he is the owner of the Wild Look Photography. So go online and check out his work and think about purchasing something this year for your kids, friends, or family for Christmas. Also, don't forget about Northern Latitude Foods and their wild rice to go with your duck dinners this holiday season. You can get 10% off your order of their amazing wild rice from Idaho with the discount code FowlWeather2024. We've been having turkey and mushroom soup with wild rice, using it in venison stir fry, and just having it as a side with our shirky cut roast duck. So get you some wild rice to go with that wild game. It makes a great and unique Christmas gift. Again, that's 10% off your order of their amazing wild rice from Idaho with the discount code FowlWeather2024. Also, with all the new listeners, we've been asked a lot about the WSI and how it works so well to predict duck migration, so we put up a specific page with a link to our WSI info video. Visit us at FowlWeather.co and click on the migration page in the upper right. All right, on to this week's duck migration forecast. Let's start in the east and move our way west again this week, and I couldn't be happier for our mid and South Atlantic flyway friends. After how dismal last year was, we are seeing WSI values this year that are really good and very early, great enough to push all ducks other than black ducks and mallards south into as far as South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida this week. Look for Atlantic Coast pintail migration early and late in the week, and new gadwall, green-winged teal, widgeon, and shoveler all week. For the mid-Atlantic, you may lose some early migrating dabbling ducks that are noted above, but you should really pick up black ducks, mallards, and diving ducks this week. This will be especially true for the Maryland, Delaware latitude, and black ducks, specifically along the coast on Long Island and New Jersey. Thursday and Friday into Saturday morning look like the best bet for fresh ducks all up and down the coast. Over in the Mississippi Flyway, I'd be in the duck blind this week if you can. Ducks on the move early and late in the week on favorable north and northwest winds is the prediction. Mallards should be peaking in mid-latitudes, and pintails should really be on the move into the deep south early and late this week. All other dabbling and diving ducks should increase south of Memphis, Tennessee, with increasing numbers of ducks all week. There's also a disturbance that will bring rains across Texas and into coastal Louisiana overnight on Wednesday into Thursday a.m. that is sure to help out with new pintails likely pushing through to the coast by Thursday a.m. or afternoon. In the Central Flyway, interestingly, the weather moderates and mallards hold up pretty much where they are at, so the latitudes of Kansas, Wyoming, and Colorado should sustain at or near peak mallard abundance. All other dabbling ducks and diving ducks should be on the move this week, with big increases of diving ducks expected on Oklahoma reservoirs and a push of new widgeon, shoveler, and green-winged teal into Texas and New Mexico. Best bet is for early in the week with good movements of ducks, but a trickle is expected all week. That same disturbance hitting Louisiana that I just talked about runs up the Texas coast a bit earlier on Tuesday a.m. to Wednesday and should produce some good shooting along Texas coastal regions as well. For the Pacific Flyway, going Monday through Wednesday is your best bet this week, with predicted mallard movements during this period each night into mid-latitudes from the northern reaches and movement of all other dabbling ducks all week. But again, especially early in the week, so get after it, folks. In the northern parts of all flyways at the freeze line, it's time to get after those mallards because they are making that last push to feed before the freeze-out happens. Folks, if gun barrels aren't hot, you aren't doing your homework this week. Find them ducks and go on the best days for fresh ducks hot from the north. But do remember that the Foul Weather Podcast is not responsible for your bad decisions, so please be safe out there. Thanks for listening, and as always, may your skies be filled and shoot straight, my friends.